Hi, it's Tod from Tod's Workshop and Tod Cutler here, and I am back in the Pitt Rivers Museum looking at stilettos. And with me, I have Matt Easton, Scholar Gladiatoria. First opinions, Matt?
Well, it's very pretty, isn't it?
Yeah, stilettos are pretty. I would class them in that sort of man jewellery kind of thing.
Yeah, or sometimes woman jewellery, perhaps.
Elaborate.
Yeah.
No, because
Well,
I'm asked often, what daggers do women carry? And I say
yeah.
basically not.
It's very difficult because later generations, I think, sometimes look at dainty daggers and classify that as a woman's dagger, or self-defense, or for carrying in a carriage, that kind of thing. But we don't really know. I don't know of any period sources actually saying that was the case. That being said, we do know women did sometimes carry daggers of various sorts, and sometimes carry pistols and other things. So why wouldn't you, if you're traveling in places where you think you might need to defend yourself? But by and large, I think predominantly it would have been men carrying these, military and civilian as well.
Okay, that's interesting. So my take on this, on a stiletto, is it's a civilian weapon. It is for the hoi polloi men about town, a little bit of money, a little bit of flash, like to get in a bit of trouble, basically rich thugs. But you say military as well?
Well,
I mean,
yeah,
okay, gunner's stiletto, yes.
Exactly, yeah. So we know there's this subset of gunner's stilettos which have measurements, and we don't really know what the measurements represent. That's one of the strange things about them, is they have not at equal intervals.
Yeah, they
and I've never seen.
What's the word for it? They change interval.
They sort of
decrease.
gradient. Yeah. So we don't really know what they're for measuring. Some people I've seen say they're for measuring powder depth on certain things, sometimes for the size of balls, or no one really knows, and the numbers don't seem to correspond to anything that we know of, as far as I know.
Tell us.
Yeah, if you've got a theory, but I have seen various theories, and they don't. I suspect what the answer is that the measurements correlate to different things for different stilettos, and so that we're trying to find a unified what that measurement system is, and actually it's different.
There just isn't. I mean, my take on it, because it kind of makes sense from the way materials behave, is that if you have a cone of powder, it will have a maximum angle. And you have a height of that, and that will give you the volume of that powder. Okay, yeah, big powder, little powder, but essentially you'll get that. And that, for me, would indicate why the distance between graduations alters. Whereas for bore measurement, it just doesn't make sense.
Yeah, the fact that they exist as gunner stilettos strongly suggests that some military personnel were carrying stilettos. Because a civilian doesn't need a gunner's stiletto. And if gunners had them, well, then you'd assume that other types of soldiers probably had them as well. So I generally think it's a pretty easy to carry and concealable object that probably were carried by all sorts of people, military, civilian, men, women, anybody who wanted to.
So, stiletto daggers for anybody who wanted to, of any sex, of any trade. So really they come in 16th century, mid to late 16th century, a different form to this. So by the time we get to, let's say, 1610, 1620, the classic all-metal stiletto has arrived, which is what we think of as a stiletto.
Because some have wooden grips and other
Earlier
sorts,
ones tended to, but by the time you get to, let's say, 1620, they're all steel construction, as this one is here. So that, for me, the tag dates at 16th century, I would say not.
Yeah, I mean, in style, we would say mid-17th century, so 1640, between 1640 1680, the mid to second part of the 17th century. However, they were still making stilettos, including gunner stilettos, well into the 18th century. And moreover, because people started collecting things in the 19th century, they were also made in the 19th century as well for collectors.
As a lot of things were, which can, and we were talking about this earlier with other Pitt Rivers films we've done, but you see it's not Pitt Rivers thing, it's all collections. You can never be, rarely, absolutely certain of the provenance of all parts of a piece, because they can be composite. They can be different old pieces put together, or old pieces and new pieces and so on.
Yeah, I mean, what I would say about this is I can see from the number on this that this came into the collection in 1884. The heyday of making essentially replicas for the collector's market was really in the 1880s and 1890s, but they weren't usually, not always, but they weren't usually aged. This has clearly got a pitting and patina to it, which would, suggest it dates well before that. So, I mean, basically it's almost certainly a late 17th century stiletto.
What I find interesting about this, well, lots of things, but the guard, I was in the Pitt Museum in Florence, and they have the hilt components, many stilettos, like many, go there, it's an amazing place, which have basically exactly this hilt. But they all have much fancier guards. The guard on this one is really quite simple. I wonder if it's original. I don't know, we'll probably never know. But I do know that as a family, ones like this tended to have fancier guards on them.
And sometimes with more bulbous ends.
Well, so actually I'll just show you this. So this is a replica I've done of the Pitt Rivers Stiletto. But actually there's another one of this stibbit here, which we do. And that has the bulbous ends. And so that has much more fancy guard work, which you associate, you know, the fanciness of the stiletto doesn't just end with the grip, it very often goes into the guard.
And very, very often, not always, but very often we see the style of the pommel echoed in the terminals of the quillon.
And this is not there.
It's a different style. And they're quite interesting if you've held a Febb & Sykes commando dagger from World War II. They actually have a similar feel to them, although that is edged and so therefore not strictly speaking a stiletto. Although in World War II, both in America and Britain, people did refer to commando daggers as stilettos. One of the defining features of most stilettos is they don't really have cutting edges, do they? They've got edges, but they are very much spikes.
Sometimes they don't even have that. So again, looking through the stibbit, I particularly remember because there were cabinets maybe that big with many, I'm going to say 50 stilettos on it, and then two more shelves like that, and then another cabinet like that. So they had hundreds of stilettos. And the one which was most notably tiny had a blade on it maybe about that long, and it was about 4mm diameter rod, and that was it. So that it didn't even pretend to have a cutting edge. But the blades are always interesting because some of them are kind of like this one's star-shaped, but traditional diamond-shaped dagger blades. Some of them are square, some of them are round, some of them are flat-backed triangle like that. They're all sorts of things, but what they rarely are is the absolute diamond shape of a traditional dagger, as you think of it.
And I think, you know, linguistically as well, stiletto, Italian word, but stillet, I think, means, I mean, it's like a writing spike,
pen,
isn't it? Yeah, so it's literally a spike. So if we were to give them an English name, we'd probably call them spikes.
Yeah, that would do. Bluntly put it, they are for poking, sorry, bad joke. To bluntly put it, they are for poking holes in things. They are not for cutting. That's not what stilettos are about.
What it reminds me of as well, because at the ricasso you've got two fullers, it's a midrib going between them, and then that transitions into a flattened diamond section which has two other fullers that are not joined with the original ricasso fullers. And that transition is something we see in a lot of rapier and early small sword blades, and indeed, and there might be a relationship here, with main gauche left-hand daggers. So I don't know for certain, but I suspect there's some degree of relationship between left-hand daggers and stiletto. And it is interesting that these come about around the same time, but also to an extent as the left-hand dagger is going out of fashion. So is it possible that, because in this period most people using rapiers switched to just using the single sword, and in fact there's even sources from the 1650s saying how, people don't use the dagger anymore, they just use the single sword, and then very soon after that we get a small sword which only uses the single sword. So is it that perhaps manufacturers of left-hand daggers went, we need to stay in business, let's create a new thing. It is interesting that these come around at the end of the life of the left-hand dagger, because if you've got a left-hand dagger, you wouldn't need a stiletto.
A flared pommel on here, which is then fluted. Generally speaking, you'd mark that out into 8 sections and you'd put your flutes out, because 8 is easy, right? You might do it into 6, because 6 is relatively easy. This has got 7, which is like really difficult.
Just to make life difficult.
Yeah, it's an odd choice to have made for the hand manufacturing of something, because it makes the laying it out that much harder.
Maybe they didn't lay it, maybe they just eyeballed it and that it ended up being that.
Oh, it's very even, it's very nicely done. So what we've got is a very nice long steel hilt here, obviously with a very delicate tang the whole way through. You can actually see it's maybe about 6mm thick here, but then we'll taper down rapidly. Comes all the way through and is riveted through at the end there. But what looks like a separate peen button probably isn't. It looks to me like it's all one piece. So it's actually only 3 components in this dagger.
As a kind of noob non-manufacturer question, that is completely cylindrical. So do you think that would have been made on a lathe?
It's very early for that sort of lathe manufacture.
Okay.
I can't honestly comment. Does it look like it's made on a lathe? Absolutely it does. It really does.
I mean, that's how you make it in the modern world.
Oh, for sure, that's how you make it.
I mean, it's just interesting. Whenever a grip is perfectly cylindrical, I always ask why. And you know, for example, with a da, for example, often the answer is because they use bamboo or rattan, which is round, or ivory, which is a tusk, which is round. You know, so sometimes there's material reasons for why something's round, but often edged weapons don't inherently want to have a round grip.
No.
Although in this case you don't need edge alignment, but still, it just makes, whenever I see something that's perfectly cylindrical, I always question why.
Yeah, but this came about in the first place because I woke up one day in, I think it was about June, and I thought, you know what, I want to make a stiletto. So I contacted the Pitt Rivers, and they're very accommodating, but they weren't able to get me in to look at it until the September. And I was just too impatient. So I took my one picture that I managed to get off the internet, and I made a reproduction of it, which now we sell as a Tod Cutler piece. So the reproduction is here, and you know, fairly close, taken from that one picture. So not bad. There are some slight changes, but you know, it's a fairly close piece. But the most notable thing is what I've done here is replace the cruciform blade on this one with a flat back diamond, which again is very typical for stilettos.
Very common on stilettos, yeah.
But what is also interesting is they all, as far as I can gather, have this ricasso type function. They're not sharpened or semi-sharpened all the way up to the hilt.
Yeah.
And I know that you've got a theory about this, and I like your theory. So,
Well, yeah, so I mean, I've looked at a number of antique stilettos over the years, and this is actually a fair length grip, but some of them are really, really short. And in fact, a friend of mine owns one and lent it to me for a video, and I was holding the thing, and it was just so awkward. And then I just went like that, and I was like, now it makes sense. And the interesting thing is, if you put your finger over here, you've got a ricasso. It's exactly the depth of one finger. This essentially functions as a ricasso as well. So it's completely secure, but it also locks into the hand with that little guard, because it's quite a dainty thing to hold securely. But as soon as you put your finger over, and I would say your thumb on the underside there, which also sits on the ricasso, the same height as your finger, and this is very similar to how rapiers were often gripped at this period.
So that one has got a smaller handle, and actually, again, that's one of the things which is evident from the stibbet.
Yeah.
Is so many of the stiletto daggers were just minuscule in the grip.
Although we typically, with most rapiers, put one finger over the crossguard, that was, I would say, the sort of 70% most common way of holding a rapier, but not everyone held a rapier like that. Some people held it with the flat, horizontal like that, with the thumb on the flap. Some people held it fully below the guard, but the Spanish later on sometimes put two fingers over the guard, and as a result, some of the late Spanish cup hilts have incredibly short grips because you've only actually got two fingers over the grip, and the other two fingers are inside the bowl guard over the cross guard. So you look at the hilts and you think, wow, that's an incredibly short grip, but it's because you've got fewer fingers on it. And the advantage, of course, as well of having a smaller hilt is it's more concealable, it's easier to wear.
So another aspect of the theory that you're proposing about why you put your finger across the guard here is that suddenly you begin to conceal something. And humans are really good at pattern recognition. We're really good at remembering faces and square shapes in nature and things like that. And a very recognisable pattern, if you like, is a dagger. And so this is a little bit earlier, but left-hand dagger, very identifiable form. You can see it's a dagger. The moment you start to cover that, you begin to lose its form. And suddenly, no longer is it a dagger, it is just a little spiky thing.
Yeah, and it's very difficult to see. We find in various literature coming all the way through to the modern age, this idea that stilettos are sneaky, nefarious kind of...
Well, do you think that they were? I mean, my gut reaction is, at times, they are going to be.
Yes, these sorts of weapons have always been used, unfortunately, for always not for the the best of intentions. It's just something I noticed that with this particularly slender type of dagger, when you grip it in this way, essentially the whole of the hilt disappears into the hand. And we know that obviously these could be held down and concealed and things. For example, if you had your cloak wrapped over your arm, then you're just a person walking along carrying your cloak, but you've got that underneath it. You know, it's not to say that they weren't, I'm sure they were used point down some of the time, but to me, that doesn't feel like that was how these were intended to be used.
I mean, the thing is as well, if you've got a blade like this, which is, okay, it's sticking out, and you can show that to camera and go, oh, well, clearly he's got a blade in his hand. But actually, I'm just going to go and get a cloak. Here I am. But so suddenly, if you are wearing something, you know, which is a little bit longer, a coat or whatever it might be, obviously you can't see it like that. It allows you actually even to stab through. That's not a problem at all. So nobody's ever going to see it. Once you've got sort of vertical movements like this, just another little bit of verticality around it, you don't really see it very much. And you're not going to see it until you're passing by and you're done. Yeah. And so I think whether they were for doing evil, I suspect they were on occasion, but my goodness, they were perfectly fitted to it.
At this time, we only have to look at period portraits and art to see how much clothing people were wearing. You know, they didn't just walk around in a t-shirt or even just a t-shirt and a sweater. They were wearing, you know, a doublet, and then they were having maybe a coat over the top of that and a cloak over the top of
and
that.
And you've got your shirt. You might have a paw point as well, which has got another 2 or 3 layers.
Might have a ruff, might have a big old hat, and all of this kind of stuff.
So you could have easily, you could have 8 or 10 layers of cloth over the main important parts of the body.
Very noticeable that ethnographically speaking, in parts of the world where people have fewer layers of clothing, cutting weapons tend to be more popular.
Oh, is that right?
Well, generally speaking, yeah. And whereas when you come to colder places, or where people were wearing lots of layers of clothing, especially at this time, I think the climate was a bit colder as well than it is today, then thrusting weapons are gonna make sense because they don't have a problem going through clothing. Cutting doesn't really.
But also, for any of those paranoid types who were wearing secrets, you know, sort of a bit of mail or something like that under, as we've done experiments before, I suspect that these would not have much of a problem going through mail.
Well, that's a very interesting point, and actually it's that this is the century, the 17th century, is where we find obviously dueling reached a bit sort of epidemic, particularly in France. And one of the things that people took to wearing, duelists took to wearing, was actually a very fine mail glove, which enabled you to grab the opponent's rapier. And a few of these survive in museums. So if you're living in a culture where people are literally wearing self-defense items, hidden armour under their clothes, a secret, as it's called, hidden helmet, essentially, skull cap underneath their hat, and maybe mail gloves for grabbing opponents' blades, that will bypass most of those things. Essentially. So mail maybe this is something we could test, but that should pop a mail ring relatively easily, I would think.
Really, if we just have a look at the two, size by size, length is good. Well, I'm a little bit thinner on the handle, a little bit thinner on the top rondel, but, you know, from my one picture that I had, a reasonable facsimile of it. But it was a lovely piece. So, I mean, again, I'd say thank you very much to the Pitt Rivers for letting me come in and handle these and look at them. I've always liked stilettos, I think partly because they're different to everything else.
Weirdly, I also find they're quite useful tools as well. If you need to push something through, like a point through an eyelet or something, they're quite useful to
open a letter.
A bit like a knitting needle, basically.
and some of them were. That's it, really. So, Matt, thank you very much for your time and your insights. And thank you again to the Pitt Rivers for allowing us to do this. See you again. We've both got Patreon pages, so if you want to help support what we do, that would be brilliant. Come down to our websites, have a look. If you like this, you'll like what we do. And the Stibbet and the Pitt Rivers stilettos, both available from todcutler.com. Thank you. Bye-bye.